Now you might imagine what is Shell doing here in GITS, right? Shell is basically an oil and gas company, right? So let me clarify one thing. Shell is not just an oil and gas company. It has a huge set of developers working for it to develop in-house software, in-house software to support its different businesses that are there across the globe. So in terms of numbers, we have around 5,000 plus developers in India, and our strength across the globe is around 17,000 developers. So it's a huge developer community that we have in Shell, right? With that, let me move on to Agile Hub. So basically, I work in a vertical called as Agile Hub. And Agile Hub, what it does is it tries to come up with technical solutions for some of the business problems that Shell has, right? So let's take an example. So let's say there is a distributor who wants to buy a lubricant, right? And he doesn't really know what to do, how to search for that lubricant, right? So that's where we come in. We basically build a solution such that it caters to the end user and also helps Shell to generate revenue out of those end users, right? So that's what we do. Now, in terms of how we operate, we have 5 engineering principles. In terms of tech stack, we prefer to use open source technologies. For example, we use React for front-end development. We use Golang or any other open source technologies for back-end development, and similarly other open source technologies that are there out in the market. So that's about the tech stack that we use. Now in terms of architecture, what we do is we have a predefined set of guidelines that we follow, and we are free to use any kind of software solutions which basically follow these kind of guidelines. The next is we don't use UI based development where instead we basically code to develop softwares. Now in terms of deployment, we follow CI/CD, which is basically continuous integration and continuous deployment, wherein it basically is a seamless delivery mechanism where whenever you push a piece of code, it basically goes through quality checks, and if everything is fine, it will automatically get deployed to the production, right? So that's what we follow. And in terms of runtime environment, we all our services are Dockerized, containerized, and in some cases we do use serverless, right? So these are the 5 principles that we follow in Agile Hub. What I'm going to cover is what is chatbot, what are the advantages of using chatbot, what do you need in order to build a chatbot, then you need NLP, obviously. How do you train that NLP? NLP is basically natural language processing, and once you have built the solution, how do you test the solution, how do you evaluate the quality of the solution, and finally we'll look at what are some of the drawbacks that comes through building a chatbot rather than having an actual human addressing some of the user queries, right? And if time permits, I'll basically have a small demo at the end. So yeah, so what are chatbots? Chatbots are basically it's a computer program that you design to simulate human-like conversation, right? So let's say you want to search for something, right? So you will go to a web page like Amazon and you'll search for something, right? But Amazon, what it'll do is it'll search for the exact product, and it doesn't really understand the context of the user, right? So that's where NLP comes in, where you need NLP to understand the user context and accordingly act on it, right? So that's where chatbots combined with NLP comes as a solution, right? So with that in mind, the next is once you have understood what chatbot is, and basically the next step for you would be obviously gauging what are the different kind of benefits that you get out of chatbot, right? So the first is obviously chatbots being a machine, it can run round the clock. So you can have it run 24/7 without any interruption, right? So that's the first advantage that you get out of chatbot. The second is scalability, right? So let's say you have built a product which is trending quite a lot recently. So it's really simple to scale up chatbots. All you have to do is increase the infrastructure that you have in terms of resource, memory resource, or CPU resource, right? And it'll scale to that point. So in terms of scaling, it's really simple to scale the chatbot. The next advantage that you get out of chatbot is cost saving. So ideally, you would have someone like a person, like a human, who would be sitting at the other end trying to answer some of the user queries, right? So hiring a person and doing that job is much more costly compared to having a machine answer those trivial queries, right? So that's where you can have a bit of cost saving aspect associated with chatbots. These are some of the advantages that you get out of chatbot. Now, let's move on to the next thing, which is basically there are different solutions out there in the market in terms of NLP, right? So there is AWS, there is Azure, there is Google, which offers a wide range of NLP products which are there, right? So you can't just blindly go and pick any and use it within your product, right? So first is you have to understand what is your product needs, what kind of user base you have, what kind of scenarios you want to handle, right? So it can be as simple as, let's say you want to build a chatbot to answer very trivial queries like FAQs, right? So it can be as simple as that, or it could be very complicated, like something like conversational AI, which basically has to understand the context of the user, act on it, and then remember what was the context in the previous question, and then answer the next question, right? So depending on what's your use case, you basically go and evaluate different solutions and try to fit in the best solution which basically suffices your need, right? So once you have that in mind, you have finalized what NLP solution you want to integrate with. The next step is to train that NLP solution, right? So assuming that you already have significant data to train that NLP, the next step is to train it, right? So there are three terminologies that are normally used within all of the NLP solutions, which is token, entity, and intent. So token is basically any, it's the smallest, sorry, it is the smallest unit of text. It could be a single word, or it could be punctuation, or it could be an entire sentence. So that's token. And these are just definitions which will come in later, as in you can relate to these definitions once I go into the details of the training methods. So that's about token. The next is entity. Entity is basically anything specific to what you want to extract from the user query. So basically it could be a piece of information that you want to extract from the user query. And intent is basically recognizing the purpose or the intention of the user. So these are some of the basic terminologies that are being used across most of the NLP solutions, right? So now how do you go about training these NLP solutions, right? So let me take an example. So let's say you want to build a chatbot which basically gives information about different mobiles which are there out in the market, right? So let's say you have iPhones, you have Samsung, you have other brands, right? So what you would do is you would take these names of the mobiles and you would store it as an entity. So that's how you train it. You train your NLP to store these entities. Now the next step is, with these entities you can't do anything. You have to understand the intent of the user and then correlate it with the entity, right? So for that there is something called as training phrases. So training phrases are basically the end user query. So let's say the user searches for I want information about iPhone 7, right? So here, what your training mechanism will do is it will extract the intent, which is basically some kind of information that you want, and it will then mark iPhone 7 as an entity, right? So now what will happen is with the pretext, which is I want to search for, that's the pretext, and the entity, which is iPhone 7. So your NLP will generate different combinations of these pretexts and these entities, and basically store it within the system. So what this will do is, let's say further down the line, when the user searches for, instead of I want to search, I want information about iPhone 7, if the user searches for I want specifications of iPhone 7, then your system will be intelligent enough to understand that it's the same intent that the user has triggered, right? So that's how you go about training your NLP solutions, right? Now, that's about training. Now there is very specific scenario which is very common across all the chatbots, which is basically supporting different languages within the bot, right? So if you see India, even within India, there are lots of different languages that people speak and type as well, right? So a chatbot needs to have multi-language support by default, as I would say. So for that, so language is very tricky to deal with, because different languages will have different slangs, different intricate details that you have to understand and accordingly train the bot, right? So even though it's tricky, it's not impossible to deal with, but there are corner cases that you can't really predict those, because of which those might come to those might lead to some of the corner cases, which then basically will lead to your application behaving in a different manner, in a way which you don't really intend to. So you have to take care of these scenarios when you want to have a multi-language support in your chatbot, right? Then there are three ways you could develop multi-language support. The first is you could have a set of translations which are there stored within the system, so that you don't have to basically deal with on the fly translation. So this is like you have a clear idea of what you want, what the user might use your chatbot for, and you have defined those rules, and basically you just recognize those intents and fetch those statically defined translations, and you show it back to the users. So that's one way to do it, which is mostly for very simple use cases. But for more complex ones, you could also have it like something which you can do is you could translate the text on the fly. But then when you do this, there are as I said, there are different scenarios that you cannot really think about or estimate for, which might lead to like unseen or errors within the system, right? So normally what people use is a mix of both, where you have static translation within the system, and for some of the use cases you have dynamic translation, which is translation on the fly. So these are some of the things that you might have to think about when you deal with multi-language support within the chatbot. Now the next thing that I want to talk about is testing. So how do you go about testing a chatbot? Because when you deal with NLP, it's really difficult to have a boundary around how the user might use your chatbot, or how your system might behave with respect to the user queries, right? So there are basic testing mechanisms that you could have. One is testing with respect to the entities and the intents that you have within your system. So you could write simple Cypress test cases. So Cypress is basically a testing framework that you could use, and you could write test cases to have these default scenarios tested and verified within the NLP solution. The next is end-to-end testing. So basically, when you say end-to-end testing, it's actually the exact user input that comes in. So for example, like what I said, a user wants to search for an iPhone 7 specifications, right? So that would be a part of end-to-end testing, where you would test the entire system for all the integrational bits which are there within the system. The next is obviously manual testing, where you would have a quality assurance team which does test your which does the testing of your software. Yeah. Yeah, sorry about that. So I have a couple of slides. The previous one was what I covered, and the next and this slide is about the demo. So yeah, sorry about that. Yeah. Okay. So in terms of testing, the next one, the next testing that you would obviously want to do is performance. So you would definitely want to benchmark your APIs and see how it's performing. In terms of understanding what is the threshold or what is the limit that you could expose your services to, so that in terms of, let's say there's a lot of traffic coming into your system, so you can auto scale your servers, right? So that's about performance. Then obviously you need to build your services so that it's secure. So having those making sure that your software is secure, addressing all the security vulnerabilities within software, basic things like all the API calls should be secure. You should not expose any data to the public if it's PII. So things like those you have to take care. And lastly is language specific testing. So it's a bit difficult to do that because of the way it is. You cannot train a computer to basically test each and every scenario, right? So that's one of the limitations that comes on with multi-language support, right? The next, so with all these good things, there are obviously drawbacks with chatbots, right? So the first one is, since it's a machine, it would lack some of these basic human qualities like emotions, empathy, and intelligence, right? So there might be customers, or there might be some of the cases where you need to have these qualities where you could help the other person out with some of the queries that the other person has, right? The next is very obvious, which is basically it's a software, right? So there will always be some kind of maintenance activity around it, some kind of upgrades that comes along with software, right? So you would need to have that support team to have these maintenance activities done on a periodic basis. So that's another drawback that comes in with the chatbot. The next is so chatbots are trained on data, right? So basically what it means is you have a boundary around what the chatbot could do, right? So it's not really that intelligent to handle very complex use cases or situations, right? So for that you would need a person who might be able to help out the user with these kind of very complex scenarios. So that's another drawback that comes out of chatbot. And lastly, again, since it's a program, you always have that security risk of maybe there's a data leak, or maybe something else with respect to security, right? So that is something that you definitely have to take care of when you build any kind of software, right? So these are some of the drawbacks that are there with respect to chatbot. Now, the last thing that I want to cover is with respect to error handling. So basically, when you train NLP, it in some cases behaves in a very weird way, which you can't really uh, expect when you develop these kind of solutions, right? So for that, what you would have is something like a default fallback mechanism, where if it goes out of what you expect it to do, you could trigger this default fallback mechanism where um, it can basically lead to graceful what do you say handling of error, right? So the user should not see a stack trace like this has failed, right? So the user should not be able to see that, or else there might be situations where your NLP solution gives back a very random or a very inaccurate answer to the user query, right? So some of these use cases can be, or some of these edge cases can be handled by having a default fallback mechanism, right? And uh, so with that, you also need to have some kind of mechanism where you could catch these errors, you could understand why it's failing. Can we train the NLP in such a way that it recognizes these kind of errors and basically somehow manages these errors by itself? So you could have that mechanism as well within your system. And finally, you could also have user feedback, where you could take the feedback of the user to understand how your chatbot is behaving. Are you satisfied with the um, um, responses that you have gotten through the chatbot, right? So yeah, these kind of things that you have to take care when you have to take care when you build a chatbot, right? So uh, the last thing that I want to cover is the demo part. So basically, here what we have is Shelly. So this is a chatbot that we have built to help users understand or basically get information about different kind of lubricants that Shell offers. It's deployed in 11 countries. It supports 4 different languages. Um, it 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 has handled about 750,000 interactions. Since it's a chatbot, it is 24/7 available. So these kind of things that I've already covered within the talk, right? So let me quickly go and demo this chatbot. So this is a live application that we have. This is a website where we basically give in information for all the different kind of lubricants that we have. There are other services as well, which I will not go into the details. So if you see down at the bottom right, you will see the chatbot that we have built. So this is basically a chatbot that has an NLP integration. So let's say a user types in I want information about TELUS. Okay, so what has happened here is basically so this user input has been divided into different tokens, where each token is corresponding to a single word, and then after tokenizing this user query, what happens is the NLP will try to match every token with the entities that are there within the system, right? So what it did was it matched TELUS, which is one of our product families, and it gave us back the information about that product, right? So yeah, so this is basically a small demo of how a chatbot works and how you can integrate with NLP to solve some of the basic user queries that you get, basic or trivial user queries that you would frequently get from the users, right? So with that, I'll end this session. Thanks a lot for joining in today.